In this new academic year, the UWI is introducing for the first time a redesigned suite of foundation courses, beginning with Caribbean Civilization. Now, you've spoken about the activist university and the role of the student body. Can you explain how these foundation courses can help shape the UWI learning experience?
There was always a perception, given the disciplinary diversity of the university, and given the fact that we are a regional university with a global vision, and given that in the many nation states across the Caribbean that are producing our students, that the university ought to create the context and the content with which our students can emerge with a kind of unified intellectual identity. That is, that they are exposed to the common questions that Caribbean citizens have to answer. Let's assume then that students enrolled in UWI from disciplines as diverse as the creative arts, applied sciences, medicine, engineering, that there are certain conversations that students ought to be very proficient in participating. Issues, for example, such as Caribbean culture and identity, issues around the political conversations that created nationhood, issues about the obstacles to economic development. That these are conversations and discourses that students, irrespective of their own disciplinary traditions and the choice of programs, ought to be able to speak to clearly. Because if you graduate from our university as an engineer or as a dancer or a medical practitioner, you ought to be able to speak to these questions about the Caribbean world and the relation of the Caribbean world to the wider world. So a common pedagogy for classroom discourse was always seen as the way to prepare our students and to create what is called the core message of a UWI education. That was the thinking, but we all recognize that from time to time that will change. The reason why we have now opted to move these programs into a different format of delivery and to create an ICT platform to enable students to access this content and to enable the professors across UWI to reach students in real time. The purpose of all of this is to move our students deeper into the digital age. We have an interest in making sure that all of our students are extremely mobile, extremely comfortable with all the learning and research technologies. And the best place to begin is with these foundation courses so that these technical skills are appreciated and mastered in the formative stages of the academic journey. And so we are engaging at multiple levels simultaneously. Plus, of course, the vision that the one UWI, that is, that now we have 4 campuses with distinct identities, to communicate to our students, yes, that you might be on the open campus, Mona, St. Augustine, Kefil, but you are a UWI student, that all students ought to have an experience of being taught by professors from another campus, so that you do not graduate from one campus with only pedagogical experiences within the confinement of that campus. And so we are hoping to produce a generation of students who are exposed to some of the finest academics across the university system, across the campus structure. And to do this within the context of embracing the ICT and the learning technologies, using the internet and all of the technologies of the internet, it's a wonderful thing to see students at home, in the library, in their cars, on the minibus, whatever, however, listening to their lectures on the platform that is provided for them. and to have ongoing access to it so that, you know, it's 24/7 access and it's continuous.
I want to end by asking about Caribbean civilizations specifically and the perception of some that it is a history course. As an economic historian yourself, what would be your response to that?
I wouldn't say that Caribbean civilization is a history course. What I would say is that it has a strong historical dimension. And that's quite a different issue altogether, because all disciplines do have a historical dimension. All of them do. If you are a medical student, then you ought to know the history of medicine. You ought to know the history of diseases in the Caribbean. You have to be exposed to all the pandemics and epidemics that we've had in our Caribbean world in the last couple of 100 years. So all of our disciplines do have a historical dimension. That is natural. If you're an economist, then you ought to know about the trends and patterns that have made the Caribbean economy what it is. Just a few days ago, I spoke at the UNDP launch of the Caribbean Human Resource Report. And what we were able to establish is that among the world's economies, the economies of the Caribbean are typified by the greatest degree of inequality in terms of the distribution of wealth, of income, and access to investment capital. And the inequality is a problem for sustaining these economies. But if you want to understand that, you need to know why is it that our economies are so structured, and why is it that we take it for granted that we live in economies where 5% of the population might own 90% of the investment wealth. Those kinds of disparities we take for granted. I think that they ought to be seen as historical constructs rather than contemporary processes to be validated. So I would say that the historical perspective is important, but the thematic content of that program ranges from conversations about religion to the performing arts, to language and linguistics, yes, to history and to sport, because it is focusing upon how the Caribbean people have evolved into a distinct Caribbean civilization, so that there are issues surrounding the sustaining of European culture, Asian culture in the Caribbean, African culture, the indigenous cultures, and to understand all of those cultural matrix and how they came together to produce a Caribbean civilization. Yes, you would need to have an historical perspective, but for the life of me, I am not able to understand how any student or any citizen could imagine that they could comprehend their reality as it is now and to think about the future without a historical perspective. So if it has a stronger historical perspective than the many students would prefer, it is also an opportunity to help to create for them an appetite for historical reflection as a precondition for understanding the world today and the kind of world they want to create for the future.
Wonderful.
Thank you.